Most we do are not quarreling, arguing, debating, challenging. We interact in communication, in a two-way communication. So we're all experienced in dialogue. This is the only way that we can live as members of a peaceful community. And yet, this experience, which is very common to every human being, seems to be extremely difficult if we move above from individual experiences to communal and now to the civilization of dialogue. It's extremely complicated. I would argue one of the main reasons is historical. The situation is changing, and we're still very much in that situation. It's the emergence of what I call the Enlightenment mentality of the modern West. The Enlightenment mentality of the modern West emerged on the 18th century, 19th century, gathered tremendous momentum. This mentality is by far the most powerful ideology in human history. Just imagine that both socialism and capitalism came out of this mentality. It is true with many of the great institutions, such as the market economy, democratic polity, civil society, modern universities, like one here, multinational corporations, civil or military bureaucracies. Not only these great institutions, but the underlying values. Sometimes we call it universal values, or global values, such as liberty, rationality, equality, human rights, due process of law, and of course dignity of the individual. So this Enlightenment mentality is overwhelming. It's still the most powerful ideology. Even though some of the very brilliant and, let's say, courageous minds in the last 50 years or so, in the West in particular, have challenged time and time again the domination of the Enlightenment mentality. The feminists, the environmentalists, the communitarianists, the religious pluralists, and people who celebrate the cultural diversity and so forth. But in Asia, both East Asia, and maybe South Asia and Southeast Asia, and a lot of American countries, Islamic world, and so forth, this mentality is still one of the most challenging forces in human history. Let me demonstrate this by an example, the Chinese example. I didn't know earlier, I now notice this lecture is delivered May 4th. And as you know, it was such an important date in modern Chinese history. The May 4th movement, 五四运动, in 1919. This was the beginning of the major decline or disintegration of the Confucian world order, of the tradition that I cherish and very much identify. This is the disintegration of traditional Chinese culture, of Confucianism. Why? Because some of the most brilliant minds in China believe that there's only one way human history will progress, and the Western way. China will have to learn from the West. And if learning from the West is predicated on China's ability to get rid of its own tradition, which is the feudal past, China should have the courage to do so. And therefore, these great minds, these are not your everyday intellectuals, these are the giants in modern Chinese history, such as Wu Xun, Fu Shizhi, Chen Duxiu, Li Dazhao, form a kind of united front in arguing the only way out for China, Chinese as a whole, is to learn from the West, therefore wholesale Westernization. In order to formulate their argument, to publicize it, to make it very persuasive, they decided to use a strategy, for lack of a better description, I would say to compare the worst of your own culture with the best of Western culture. This strategy was used, and of course now China is still suffering from the consequence of this. What is Chinese culture? What is Chinese character? What are the important features of being Chinese? Well, the authority of the father over the son, the authority of the ruler over the subjects, the authority of the husband over the wife. Hierarchical, conservative, not to mention opium smoking and foot binding. These are expressions of the, from Lu Xun's point of view, 国民性, Chinese character. That's the reason why this incredibly powerful short story, RQ. Almost every Chinese is a manifestation of the spirit or lack of spirit of RQ. What happened to the West? What is the West? Well, West, democracy, science, liberty, law, human rights, and dignity of individuals. There's no reference, for example, to American society concerning the negative features. Everybody knows America suffered, for centuries from slavery. And racial discrimination continued until the 60s. It may still be a major shadow in American politics. None of the negative features, for example, Nazism, of course, that happened a bit much later, but earlier, all kinds of collectivism and so forth, nothing. So with this kind of comparison, of course, there's no dialogue. There's a sense of humiliation, sense of impotence, sense of not only restlessness, but there's also a sense of hopelessness. This is the condition in which China entered the 20th century. And there's no possibility of a dialogical relationship between China, the representative of the East, and the West. My wishful thinking, my wishful thinking, of course, I jumped from the Opium War, roughly 1839 to 1979. I jumped over all this period and tried to talk about the present situation. But only with one footnote. From the Opium War of 1839 to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, every 10-year period, there was a major restructuring of the society, major rupture. Every 10-year period. From 1949 to 1979, for these 30 years, during the period of the People's Republic of China, every 5 years, there's a major change. The Korean War, the Great Leap Forward, the 3 years of incredible starvation, more than 30 million people died of starvation, the Cultural Revolution in the first part of it and the second part, so forth. So in this period of time, from the Opium War to modern China, by way of the May 4th generation, the landscape is totally restless. And it is understandable. It's difficult for us to imagine the rise of China. And China becomes an economic power, and with expanded political influence. It's very difficult for us to imagine if we continue to carry this historical weight. But the situation definitely has changed. And so my wishful thinking now is to have a new kind of dialogue. It's not the worst of my culture to compare with the best of your culture, or the best of my culture to compare with the worst of your culture, or any kind of strategies in between. It should be the dialogue among core values. That's one possibility. There are numerous other possibilities. You may think it's very idealistic, but I don't think that's the case. In other words, we begin to think not only about the possibility of the best of our culture, but also the possibility of the best of my dialogical power. That becomes the possibility of some kind of joint venture, because we have to come up with a joint venture now for the human race, because the human race for the first time has become the viability of human species is now problematic. So this need for thinking communally as members of the global community now is imperative. How do you get engaged in the dialogue of core values? We have a good example, but if we analyze it, it is very, very complex. I already mentioned the great enlightenment values, such as liberty, rationality, due process of law, and human rights and dignity of the individual. I want to ask the question, I think we should pose the question, are these values sufficient? Are they good enough for us as members of the human community to move into the 21st century? Are they really good enough? Are they sufficient? Not that they're not good. Each one of them is superb. You can say each one of them is a form of universal ethic. But collectively, put everything together, is it enough? I'll give you one example to say it is not enough. It's the idea of the economic man. The economic man is a very persuasive, powerful idea of being human in the world, especially for younger people. What is an economic man? I'm not following Adam Smith, because Adam Smith didn't consider himself as the father of economics. He considered himself very much a moral philosopher. Now, the idea of economic man is a person who is a rational animal. And the rationality is understood in terms of his ability to protect his own self-interest. If you're not even aware of your own self-interest, you're not rational. And of course, the person is motivated to maximize his profit. In a relatively free market, there's no real free market, a relatively free market, governed by law. This is the economic man. A person who's acutely aware of his self-interest, trying to maximize his profit in a relatively free economy adjudicated by law. This idea of the economic man has embodied many of the great values I talked about. Freedom, law, rights, individual, personal, individual dignity, and of course, rationality. What are some of the values that are absolutely critical, that are missing in this description of a paradigmatic example of an enlightened modern economic person? Well, first of all, the question of justice. The question of justice at all does not feature prominently in the psyche of the economic man. How about sympathy, empathy, and compassion? Not just law, but how about civility, a sense of civil discourse, civil communication? Not just rights, but responsibility. Not just the dignity of the individual, but also social solidarity or harmonious society. Now, unfortunately, the values that just outlined, these are absolutely critical for our existence, not to mention flourishing in the 21st century. Justice, sympathy, civility, responsibility, and communal solidarity and so forth. These values have been very wrongly characterized as Asian values. And especially when you say Asian values, the immediate response, especially from the West, is, oh, it's authoritarian, it's group. Therefore, it's not congenial to rights, to legal constraint, to rationality. These are not Asian values. These are universal values rooted in Asian experience. Just like liberty, rationality, law, human rights, and dignity of the individual, these are universal values rooted in the Western experience or the Enlightenment experience. The time is right now for us to share these different kind of ideas as a way of a new dialogue. Of course, I don't want to be too simplistic. I'm not looking at the world in a dichotomous way. There's the Eastern way, there's the Western way. I don't think it is right now. The time is long overdue to move beyond this dichotomous mode of thinking. So I assume that I gave a series of talks in China, and I said, one thing I would like you, these are basically undergraduates. I said, one thing I want you to do is to think beyond 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First, don't believe the world is now just governed by one superpower. The situation is changing, it changed very rapidly. Just don't believe that everything should be focused on the superpower. Don't believe the world is still divided between the socialists and the capitalists. And don't even accept some of the most